Welcome everybody to week 11. So somehow it's already the end of September and we're getting closer to the due date for the ministerial brief. I know it's not imminent, so it's due, I'm just looking at my calendar on the wall. It's due Wednesday the 21st of October at 5 o'clock. So that's partway through study week. So I realise this isn't super urgent for a lot of you, but today's class is really quite important and ideally we would give this a lot more attention in EIA. I know you can't tell, but this unit has changed really radically from last year, where the last 5 weeks had nothing to do with the main EIA process. It was about waste and waste auditing, and it made the unit quite schizophrenic in the way it jumped around, and so all of that is gone and the whole semester is just about environmental impact assessment. And I know that means that we've done a better job of that, and as part of that, Dave's here to broaden our horizon from the very heavy obsession that I have had on process and planning and the kind of skills and knowledge that you need to get work in this sector, to taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, looking at some of the theory. And this is just so important in general, in this being an academic unit, but also in terms of your thinking and your framing for your communication with Minister Jensch for your final assessment. So I'll be lurking in the background. I do encourage you to unmute and ask questions. It makes for a better dynamic and it makes for a much better recording. And it's just too distracting for too much conversation to be going on in the chat. So anyway, I will be quiet and sit in the background, and over to you, Dave.
Alrighty, thanks, Emma. Yeah, so I think I've met most of you now, or in one of the other units I've taught or on site. It's a little sad to be back in Zoom land, but I figure we're going to be doing that with this kind of material for the foreseeable future. But yeah, it's good that we can mix it up and get outside occasionally and see each other face to face. So, but yeah, I've tried to link some of the stuff we'll talk about today to those things that we've seen out in the field at Rosny Hill and Geilston Bay. So for those who know me, I guess I feel like I am a bit academic and I should not shy away from that. So I am going to talk a little bit about theory, but also about some of the things I've been involved with, and hopefully, have some connection to real world skills and the things that Emma does so well too. So hopefully this all makes sense and links and builds on the work that we've been covering the last few weeks. So I'm going to do it as a bit of a lecture, but the more you want to talk, the better it'll be. So do feel free to jump in and chat at any time. So I'll share my screen. So if I think I just share the whole thing, it might work best. So yeah, I guess, so the framing here I want to talk about is, I guess, the community and the socio sort of political context of decision making. And so these are things that I think we've started to see with, in particular with Rosny Hill, where there's, it's not a straightforward environmental impact assessment. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean, but there's a whole lot of other stuff going on. There's politics and there's community and other things that make this a bit more complicated. So this isn't unusual in urban areas, in urban development and in environmental impact assessment. So having some ability to navigate that's really important. So by the end of this, we'll talk about sort of different pathways to navigating it. There's not a single right or wrong way of doing that, but I think we need to understand that there's a whole lot of different pressures at play. So I hope some of this will be useful for the next assessment task. So obviously writing a brief to the minister is a political thing. Well, it's part of a political process. So this is one of the important things, is how we separate out this sort of scientific knowledge and evidence and and present it in a way that can be used in a political process. And maybe that the minister might change in the next couple of weeks too. I probably should be careful about what I say about that, but politics is a rapidly changing thing, and there's a little bit of pressure on the minister just at the moment. So just to start, so some of you who have done this sort of stuff with me before know I use these online polling tools. So I want to do that, but I guess I want to think about what the key messages. So if we're starting to shift to think about a political framing and a framing that involves the community, was anyone, what did you think for those who were there, or those who've looked into some of the community aspects of Rosny Hill? Was there anything that anyone took away? I'll just see if I can see who's in the room. There must be a few of you who were on site. Maybe. Anyone?
Come in if you like. Ella, Gemma, Anna. Who else was there? Mario.
Hello.
Hello.
I thought that the urban dynamic of it brought in some people that probably wouldn't otherwise have been involved in protecting the environment. I thought the Friends of Rosny Hill had probably a really weird mix of people, and that might add some complications to what they can achieve.
So I think that's a really good observation, that as soon as we start being in these places where there's a lot of people around, people are pretty complicated. And yeah, that's right. So there's different ways, different people who wouldn't normally sort of volunteer to be part of an environmental protection all of a sudden can become heavily invested in environmental protection. And I think we saw that a little bit. I mean, I think for those on site, we were a little shocked when the Friends of Rosny Hill started talking about their experiences. These are not people who we normally see involved in environmental kind of issues at all. But it felt quite passionately about this one. And so there's that idea of a local community that was really, that's really important. So as well as Rosny Hill, we also spoke to Ray, who is the environmental expert. So does anyone have a view on what Ray was saying about the environmental issues on site? So we've got this idea that the community is heavily invested, and we went and had a look at a threatened species or two. So we know that there's threatened species on site, but what was the no one's game? So I mean, Ray's clearly part of this planning system, I think, and we talked a little bit about how he worked pretty closely with the proponent to come up with designs that minimised, or to influence designs in ways that minimised environmental impact. So we didn't see this kind of adversarial process that we often see in these things, that we saw instead, that there was this kind of negotiation and ongoing, kind of reflection on the plan and changes to the plan that are meant to minimise environmental issues. Anyone else?
Come on, we have to talk about the last 5 minutes of James's talk.
I'm trying not to.
Wasn't there. I'm bursting. Trying to make eye contact with people as we look sideways into this discussion. And you're either stonily looking ahead or looking at the ground. Very odd moment.
Yeah.
It started out as kind of a good moment, being like people have to find common ground and discuss, and then we just drift into a really bad example of that.
I know, and it was so sudden after 30 or 40 minutes of incredibly convincing, well-informed, articulate argument as to why he was involved, and then all of a sudden, oh, we're somewhere else. Yes. Does anyone want to say what happened? So
I suppose everyone sort of has their own opinions.
get blindsided by their own thoughts as well.
So this is an engineer who evidently, yeah, like Dave said, didn't really care that much about biodiversity on site, knew that there were some threatened orchids, but really his attachment to the place was simply open space, and that it was kind of green and bushy was kind of about where it ended. And he's a professional engineer, so deeply informed about legislation and process, and had been very effective at kind of inserting himself into that. But the last sort of 5 minutes, we went from talking about discussing amongst stakeholders and how good it is and important it is that groups who maybe don't agree about something can nevertheless have the discussion, into his climate skeptic views and how frustrating it was that not only the Green left wouldn't discuss that climate science is still up for debate, but also friends of his from more conservative quarters also wouldn't have this discussion, at which point various kind of eyes went down and mouths dropped open. But I think it was a really good moment to show how complicated people are, and his particular perspective on the way the system worked. And Dave, you asked a really good question about his faith in the process, and this relates to what we're about to talk about. He had great faith in the process. He was just a bit frustrated that the process hadn't quite played out, or the process was ambiguous. Anyway, it was a really interesting moment.
It was nearly as interesting as the time that car was sliding towards the students that you guys couldn't see. Sorry, Scott, were you unmiking? Were you going to say something?
No, that was unintentional.
Okay, no worries.
All right. So for anybody else who wasn't up there, there was a lot of hooning at the top, and yeah, lots of sliding around in vehicles and bass music and generally having fun. Apparently it commonly happens up there when the road is wet. So it was kind of interesting because we were standing right there to see this group who regularly come to the hill, and you know it's part of their place, but they have a conflicting use of that to James, who was saying how much he hates what they do up there. So yeah, a little bit of live hill action.
They're probably opposed to the development as well, I reckon. If we got them in a room, they wouldn't be too happy about it. But maybe they can find somewhere else too. So, okay, let's take a different tack then. So I'll use this poll. I want you to, you know, from what you know, there's no right or wrong answers to these kinds of things. So if I use this poll, so for those of you who've done this before, you can go to this website, pollev.com/DaveKendall899, and it'll ask you this question. You can do it on your phone, you can do it on your computer. So have a think about these different things. You know, we've heard about the community fighting the proposal. We've heard about the planning rules. We know that there's threatened species there, and we know that it's a bit of a political process. So which of these kind of things, you know, from your, you know, best guess, do you think would be, you know, the thing that leads to this project being halted? Let's see if I can. Yeah, cool. So yeah, I should have done it so we can't see the results until the end. So there's no right or wrong answers, but cool. Interesting. I thought it was going to be planning rules for a while there, but it's becoming less popular. So it's really interesting where this has ended up. Oh, it's just changed again. Yeah. So I was kind of hoping that you would pick planning rules. I think, coming out of all of these discussions about the rules and how they make or break decisions. But I think, in reality, this is a complex situation. The community is really heavily involved in this proposal, and it's quite plausible. I think, that's absolutely plausible that the community, despite whatever the planning rules say, could lead to the development not going ahead. And similarly for political pressure too, although in this case, there's probably a bit more political support rather than opposition to it. And planning rules and threatened species, which are kind of most of the things we've been talking about the last few weeks. These are, the core parts of EIA, have come out as the least important things, which, may or may not be true. It kind of depends a little bit where the threatened species are found and other things that might happen along the way. But it's an interesting observation that there are all of these things that drive environmental impact assessment and decision making. And while it's absolutely critical, we need to work within the rules. We need to understand the rules as professionals in this space. There's other stuff that goes on, and particularly for kind of controversial things that, political pressures now equal first. That's cool. So there's other things, and I guess that this is the point of this lecture, is to start to think about, we now, I think, know a reasonable amount about how the planning rules and the threatened species stuff works, but now we can talk about this sort of politics and community and see where that fits in. All right, so I guess the question becomes, now we think that there's this community and political stuff going on, so why? Well, where does EIA fit into that, or where do politics and community fit into EIA? So thinking about a diagram of the process. So this is obviously a simplification, but we go through a process where a proposal's developed and there's some kind of assessment of environmental impacts. And we know that you see the notices around on the street frontages. We know that there's some kind of public consultation that goes on, and a decision gets made that may or may not approve the project, and there's kind of things that go on in the middle that refine it. So I feel like we know quite a lot about stuff like the environmental impact assessment process, a little bit about how things are assessed by regulators and the role of rules, planning rules and decision making. You've probably done a little bit on appeal, so there is a kind of defined process for how that can happen. But we don't know too much about this sort of public consultation and how that influences assessment by the regulator down, these bits down the bottom. So to start to introduce theory, I think that while EIA is a very applied process, and it is this, kind of learning the rules and learning the legislation, working out, what are formats of good reports and what kind of information you need to put in them to make decisions. There is, the way that the understanding of ways that decisions get made is contested. So there are different ways of thinking about how decisions get made, and those different ways of thinking about them have got different outcomes, different things that they're trying to achieve, and therefore different ways of measuring success. So we'll talk about these four. This is just one example. There's more different models that people propose as well. So we'll talk about information processing, symbolic politics, political economy, and pluralist politics. So when you're thinking about this process using these different lenses, the same outcomes, you can go through an EIA process and it could be seen as a success. The same thing, the same decision can be seen as a success or failure, depending on which lens you're using. So we've loaded up this article onto Milo. If you're interested in this, definitely have a look at that. So we'll start with, I guess, where I think we're at in the unit, which is thinking about EIA as an information processing kind of model. So we know that we've got rational decision making, we've got information, we go through some kind of criteria, trying to understand impacts, and a process about minimising or offsetting those kinds of impacts, and decisions get made. So you can kind of imagine that you get a computer program, and it could go through and, given the right information, or given all the information, could make the same decision as that whole sort of EIA planning process. And from when we start out in this world, I'm sure most of us think about EIA as this, or planning as this kind of process where, there's lots of information and people are rational and make decisions that are consistent with legislation. But that approach is kind of, it sort of falls apart in a place like Rosny Hill. So we just saw that we already think that threatened species and planning rules are going to be the least important things influencing the decisions that get made there. So all of a sudden we're outside of the realms of this understanding EIA's information processing. So are there any other, it's a question for you guys again too. So if we're thinking about examples of rational processes, so maybe let's start with what you've covered already in the unit. So you've gone through a few different examples. Does this information processing model, this rational decision-making model, does that make sense with some of the things that you've looked at so far? It's going to be a quiet group today, I think. All right. Was that Alice?
Yeah, like as in whether we think that that is how it works, or because I don't think any of the processes we've looked at actually work like that.
So, I mean, I haven't been involved that much this year in the unit, so I don't know. You've looked at some quarries earlier on. Were the quarry kind of processes, did they make sense to you? Were they, that some understanding the rules and collecting the right kind of information, the outcomes of decision making, were they predictable in those places?
I guess it depended a little bit on the complexity of the issue that was being looked at. Like if the person who came through the process submitted all the information and had all the information, then it worked well.
Yeah.
It was closer to that. But then we looked at another example where it turned out there was some guy living across the road and he was living there illegally and it all just went a bit haywire. So.
Yeah. So that's a really good point that for any pretense of a rational process to work, you need all the information available to be able to make a rational decision. So if there's information missing, all of a sudden you can make the wrong decision because there's things that would have changed the decision making that you don't know about. So that's absolutely one of the major flaws of thinking about this as a rational. But once you recognise that, there's things that you can do to try to test the quality of information that you have available, and steps that you can go through to obtain that extra information, which I'm sure you heard bits about in the quarry examples as well.
I think what was interesting for me about the Cunha quarry example is that it was pretty hidden. And I think people were surprised when there were no representations. But yeah, it's really kind of out the back of an untravelled part of the peninsula. And as far as I understood, the neighbours were supportive. And so there just wasn't a lot of fuss, even though there were wedge-tailed eagles involved. And a lot closer to the development site compared to Lake Malbina, where again, eagles are a big part of the controversy. So not similar, but two comparable examples with completely different stakeholder engagement.
Yep.
But on that point, is that because there's a difference in the quarry at Cunha was already in operations, whereas Lake Malbina is the changing of the use?
Yeah, it did have a fair bit to do with that, and the quarry is important to the economy on the peninsula, and the Three Capes track needed the material, and otherwise they were getting it from further away. So there were reasons for support, and obviously Lake Malbina is very sensitive because it was in the World Heritage Area. Well, it is in the World Heritage Area. So they're different, but there's a wedge-tailed eagle nest right at the quarry. So there is plenty for, say, a bird group to get quite angsty about.
And in a moment, we'll talk about different ways of thinking about community. So I think that the communities who are interested in those projects are quite different.
But I think the quarry owner was also amenable to trying to mitigate circumstances. So there wasn't as much to be up in arms at, because they were already in agreement with trying to limit any impact.
Yeah. Cool. I think the proponents of Lake Malvina might say that they're pretty amenable to minimising any impacts too, but we'll see how that all unfolds. Eh? All right. So we've got this idea that rational decision making needs full information, to have any chance of success at all, and it kind of works in some places, I think, where there maybe the community and the political interests aren't as invested in what's going on. But there are other ways of thinking about this process other than as a rational decision-making process. So one that's quite common in lots of different kinds of decision-making in government and other kinds of decision-making as well is we talk about pluralism. So which basically recognises that there's different people out there with different views. So rather than using a kind of rules-based and evidence-based approach to resolving, what the outcome's going to be, we can get an outcome through negotiation and compromise. So we understand that different parts of the community have got different values and different views, and we need to get people together to work out what's their shared interests in decision making. I think we heard Ray talking about that a little bit, where he said you get together and you work out where there's no difference of opinion, and so those things are agreed, and there might be some negotiation on that, but we've got this sort of shared starting point, and then there's just a few things around the edge that you need to negotiate and resolve. So that's certainly one approach. There's different kinds of approaches to achieving these kinds of things. So there's a strong argument that this leads to better community outcomes, increased acceptability, reduced conflict. So maybe that quarry example is an example a bit of this, where there's been discussions and everybody's kind of on the same page, and any differences of opinion have been able to be negotiated. So they weren't seen as conflict. They were just it was a process where you need to go through to work out how to come up with the best decision that adequately represents all of the different sort of perspectives. So we see community consultation as part of the EIA process, but it's kind of like doing this negotiation is a little bit trickier because there are these planning rules. So there's not necessarily a huge amount of flexibility, but there is some discretion depending on who puts in representations and who makes complaints about decisions as well. There's a little bit more flexibility probably in Tasmania than some other states. So Victoria, which I'm familiar with, has got quite a prescriptive. It's more difficult to get negotiated outcomes around things that are more enshrined in policy and procedures. So this idea of consultation is really important. It's, I think, a key part of most democratic processes, and some of the stuff that we hear about complaints about in Tassie, some of the EOI processes that are under scrutiny at the moment, the idea is that these are bad because decisions are made behind closed doors and there's no opportunity for public consultation. So community consultation is usually considered a good thing and important part of the process, and where that's absent, there's critiques of it being undemocratic or anti-democratic. So you see things like, we talk about advertisements or notices. So advertisements used to always be in the newspapers. You used to be able to buy a newspaper with 200 pages of classified ads, and there was a whole heap of these kinds of things in the newspapers. In Tassie, we still see notices on property boundaries, so that's kind of disappeared a bit on the mainland, or in Victoria we're unfamiliar. So it's possible that those terms will remain, but the sort of mechanisms that used to do this will change. So it could be Facebook, posts rather than notices and advertisements in the future. So sometimes there's a well-defined process. So there might be a checklist. So a lot of the threatened species work, there's checklists of people who have to be consulted. There's referral processes. So the planning has to refer things that relate to water to relevant authorities, and there's kind of these checklists of process to make sure that there is adequate consultation. There's time, specific timeframes sometimes, so that if we talk about starting and stopping the clock of consultation, so you have to provide submissions within particular timeframes. And sometimes this consultation is undertaken by the proponent rather than the regulator. So we saw that at Rosny Hill, where there was a lot of talk about how good the developers were at community consultation, and that was considered a real strength of theirs, that they were able to do that through other developments that they've done. There's perhaps a little less evidence of that in Rosny Hill, but I don't know. So in the literature on EIA, there's recognition that community consultation and public participation is important, but basically there's acknowledgement that it's mostly done pretty badly. It's done ad hoc, and that this has led, or is leading, continues to lead to poor EIA outcomes. And so improving public consultation and public participation processes is seen as a pathway to improving EIA outcomes more generally. So there's a few different ideas about why you might do public participation. I've got some, so I've got some ideas about, sorry, I'm just skipped ahead a little bit there. So doing public consultation and engaging the public in processes, you can do for a few reasons. So part of it is because you have to, it's in the, that's in the rules. So you have to put a notice on your property boundary for 30 days. You have to advertise a threatened species listing on the Federal Department of Environment's website for 28 days. Things like that. So they're not necessarily, doesn't explain why you do it. So we know we have to do it, but we don't know why. So one of the things we can think about is the collecting more information, or the provision of information. So that can be in two directions. It could be providing, to be honest, one of the reasons that there's notices on property boundaries is just to let the neighbours know that there's something going on. So they're not necessarily looking for the neighbours or the nearby residents to participate in a community consultation process. But then when the bulldozer, at least when the bulldozer turns up, they won't be shocked. They've seen this notice and they kind of know, they've got an expectation. So it's a way of providing information to the public. But another approach is to receive information. So this idea of a rational process that needs full information to be able to make good decisions. It's quite likely that that information hasn't necessarily been provided by the proponent or the other sort of experts involved. So putting out a call for more information to the public is a way of collecting more information. And flowing on from that, so some of the information that is put out by the proponent or by other people involved might actually be wrong. So it's a way of contesting the information that has been provided. So again, if we need full and correct information to make good decisions, we need some mechanisms to be able to contest the information that's being provided. So this public consultation is absolutely a key mechanism to work out, where if there are flaws in the evidence that the proponents are providing for development. So, I mean, clearly, I think there's lots of examples of those that we can think of. And the last one, and this is actually stuff that I'm really interested in and trying to do a little bit of research around, is the idea of social learning, so that people, we can stand up here and lecture you, and that's one way of learning, but there's increasingly recognition that people learn through social interactions with other people. So we learn in groups, and if people talk to each other, that's a way of sort of changing people's opinions. So we can stand up the front of a room and say, you're wrong, you should be thinking this. and it's not going to have much effect. But if you get a group of people in a room together, sitting around who are discussing things, and so people are engaging in these social processes and hearing why people may think the way they do about issues, that's a way of learning, an effective way of learning that can lead to changes in the way people think about things. Sorry, I'll just go back a little bit. Yeah, so we see that in a few different, I think we've loaded up this paper as well too, which is about public participation in environmental impact assessment, that talks about some of the purposes of public participation. Yeah, maybe other important things are that there are marginalised people in decision making. There are, for example, in urban development, renters are often excluded from decision making processes. So homeowners are prioritised. So you need to go into sort of, if you want to collect full information from a broad understanding of the community, you need to put processes in place to address that. So obviously dealing with Aboriginal people, this is an issue too. So there are different kinds of processes you need to put in place to be able to do that. All right, so that's all a bit of theory, but there's also a whole heap of practice that's going on around in this space too. So public consultation, public participation is absolutely a key skill that's really widely in demand in society at the moment. So whether that's working for government, working for proponents, there's a whole lot of private consulting, people who do public consultation. It's really a growing field, and that kind of suits people with particular skills. So yeah, so even though I'm a bit sciencey, I did a BA, and I feel like I've been involved in quite a few public consultation processes, and those sort of skills of not just being a scientist is helpful in those things. So there'll be people in this room with diverse backgrounds, and some of you probably have got really good skill sets to be able to do these kinds of things quite effectively. So I'm pointing at the IAP2. I think we put a link up to this. So IAP2 means the International Association for Public Participation. And they've got this sort of quite well-known spectrum of participation, which goes from low levels of participation about informing and moving up through higher levels of collaboration, and finally to empowerment, where you devolve decision-making to the community. So we see things like that in co-design. So co-design in planning is becoming a big issue. So there's criticisms of these kinds of models that, it's not always true that more participation is better. It might be in some cases that informing the public is actually the right sort of level of engagement that you need to do. So we shouldn't always think that further up the ladder is better. But it's sort of worth having a look at. So if I click on this, yeah. So yeah, we put up this website, and there's basically a bunch of, it's a little bit, they're trying to sell training and stuff like that. I'm not sure how that actually really should be promoting this, but it's at least worth knowing about. So yeah, they've got some resources. I think they've got, these core value awards. So I'll see if I can find, there was one, I was doing some work with the City of Melbourne in 2014, maybe 2013. Yeah, so the City of Melbourne did some work with their urban forest strategy that won a national participation award, and actually won an international award as well, where there was really interesting participation. I think I've got some more photos later on I can show you about that. So there's a whole heap of skills, and we use professional facilitators and a whole range of different things to, World Cafe forums, deliberative workshops. We talk about citizen juries, things that are really complicated. You can do deliberative democracy. There's kind of these particular processes that if you're interested in, it's worth finding out a little bit about. Maybe volunteer to be part of some of these things, but there's a whole heap of skills required to run these kinds of events and things as well. All right. And so, yeah, so as well as this applied thing, I do want to, come back to theory a little bit. So one really important message is, I think I do a whole lecture on this in KGA 332. So for those of you who did that will have seen some of this stuff, but so it's really important to understand that communities are complex. They're not, if you read or think about it from a proponent's point of view, they're often seen as a bit of a checkbox. We need to get the tick from the community so we can get ahead, get on with our development. Or you'll hear talk about things like social license. We need a social license to be able to do, probably the Mount Wellington cable car, or would be a good example of that. I'm sure that there are developers who say, if we can get the support of the public, if we can get a social license to do this, then we'll be right. We'll be able to do whatever we want. But we need to earn that license from the community. So this idea of community being stable and fixed and probably definable, particularly by geography, I think, in planning. So, the Rosny Hill community is the people who live directly adjacent to it. Is one way of thinking about that. But the more you do community engagement, and I think we did get a sense of that at Rosny Hill, we understand that they're sort of different and contested and fragmented and unstable. People come and go. And if the guy we spoke to moved to a different suburb, all of a sudden that would totally change the dynamics of the community around the Rosny Hill development. So the kinds of language I want to hear from people who've been studying this type of stuff is to understand the different views of the communities who are involved or relevant to any particular project. Having an ongoing dialogue, so it's not this sort of one-off transactional license that you earn from a fixed community. It's this sort of thing that's constantly renegotiated. So we need to work out processes to have continuous engagement. So we are, I think that local government is a bit of a leader in this space, and we're seeing that where, local government really takes engagement with the public seriously, and they're setting up these ongoing sort of forums and, inviting, people to participate in process and, contribute even to sort of simple online questionnaires and things like that. But there's this constant sort of renegotiation and dialogue that goes on with the community. I think we started to talk about this a little bit before, but there are these sort of typologies of community. So the community of interest in the Lake Malbina project is very different than the one that's of, the communities that are interested in the Rosny Hill development. So we talk about communities of interest having shared values or concerns. So that could be values that about the preservation of wilderness and the preservation of the status of wilderness for the Lake Malbina one, but it could be for the Rosny Hill that it's a community of orchid lovers who are potentially all over the state or all over Australia, who actually have got a really strong sort of feelings towards the development in this area. It could be the community of place, the people who are nearby, and that's clearly an important group in Rosny Hill. We talk about affected communities, so that they're another, you could talk about the hoons up the top, so they're going to be affected by this development. So, maybe it makes sense to try to engage with them and find out what's going on. I mean, some of that might be seen as transgressional or illegal, so maybe you wouldn't do that, but there are, lots of other kinds of users. There's mountain bike users and other things who will be potentially affected. Their use of that environment might be affected. So communities of practice. So this could be, for a lot of rural things, we talk about farmers or, people who are involved in ecological restoration as people who, may or may not be local people, but they've got this sort of shared practice that might be affected by development. Mountain bikers is obviously a big thing in these sort of urban and peri-urban sites. And communities of identity can be important too. So this could be based on Aboriginality or gender or, a whole range of different things. So there are people who have this sort of shared, some sense of community. that you may not be related to place or interests or a whole lot of other things too, some other sort of mechanism. So any process we're involved with, have a think about the different kinds of communities. And I'm sure I said that out on site a fair bit. So have a look around, who's using these spaces. At the top of Rosny Hill, you look out and you think, oh, all the people who are living in Hobart are probably seeing the top of Rosny Hill every day. You could argue that they're an important community that could be considered as well. So there's always lots. There's different communities. There's finite resources though, so we do need some kind of prioritisation. We can't do like we don't have perfect information. We can never do perfect consultation. It's expensive and time consuming. So we need to make some calls about who we think are important and who needs to be involved in the participation process. And thinking back to that spectrum, different groups can be, have different levels of participation too. We've done that. Yeah, so I'll just show you another example of this sort of City of Melbourne urban forest precinct planning, hopefully. So I think I put a link to this up on Milo as well. So this is the outcome. We did a whole bunch of workshops. I think some of them were better than others. I think the Docklands one's quite good. So this is basically just to work out what street trees to plant and where to plant them in each of these suburbs. And there was these huge workshops. We were getting 100 people. The mayor came to some of them. I was on TV shaking the mayor's hand. He was so happy with the way it all went. He's a terribly tarnished person. I'm not going to say anything good about him. So basically we sat around tables. I'll find some pictures. So we did all these, had these big events, lots of good free food, sat around tables and did these big mapping things. If you're ever in my office, actually you might be able to see it. I can probably point the window. Yeah, there's a huge map on the wall here, which is one of the maps from this, where the people in the workshop had lots of stickers, of different coloured stickers, thinking about different values and how they're important in their local neighbourhood. We used lots of photos and got people to sort photos into groups and tell us what was important and what's not important. And then the urban forest planners went away and took all this information and came up with a planting plan that was consistent with the community participation and engagement. So these things are never perfect, but I do hope that most people who came to these workshops, so whether they were passionate for native trees or passionate for European heritage with elm trees or whatever it was, came away feeling that their voices were heard and could see their values represented in the plans to some extent. So yeah, one of these ideas of a more plural kind of outcome. All right. So yeah, I don't know. Does anyone have any other ideas or examples of these kinds of processes? Anyone been involved in a citizens jury deliberative democracy? There's kind of lots of actually really interesting sort of tools and techniques that are starting to be used.
I was.
Yep,
I
cool.
used to work for a hydropower dam, and they resettled. So it was in Laos. So the Lao government was able to make the choice for the people, essentially, that they would be moved. So I came in a long time after that had happened, but the company was responsible for helping the villagers develop their livelihoods. And so they did community-based planning with the different villages. And they were really trying to go from getting a shopping list as a planning outcome, I'd like more cows, to kind of better ideas about processes and I guess more creative ideas that would have better programs that they could run from them or something. So they put a lot of money into that process, but it took ages, and the villagers didn't always enjoy being involved.
Yeah, okay. So was the process, do you think, successful overall at the end of it? It sounds pretty challenging one, I have to say.
They did it like multiple times, and I think they were kind of hampered by the different things that the company wanted to get out of it versus the government.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether it was I think it cost everyone way more than it ended up being worth.
Yeah, okay. And how do you reckon the community felt about it all at the end of it all?
I mean, I think pretty much every meeting they had someone stand up and be like, you come back every 5 years and ask us what we want and we tell you and nothing changes. So not super positively all the time.
So that's actually something I haven't said, but that actually is a really, really important point. If you're going to do community consultation, the worst thing you can do is a sham consultation where you ask people what they want and then totally ignore everything they say. So if you do that, you're going to lose the trust of the community really quickly. There needs to be follow-up. Yeah, cool. Well, that was good to hear, I think. So, I mean, that does sound like a massively challenging, that would always be a really difficult process. And obviously, there were decisions that were made prior to community consultation that have massive ramifications for the community. So it's always going to be difficult to get, consensus outcomes when half the decisions are made like that. But very interesting to hear. That was good. Anyone else? I feel like there's more and more community engagement happening. So if you haven't experienced it before now, it's the kind of thing that you'll certainly have the opportunity to if you want. And if you're interested in this field, I do think it's worth getting along to a few different things and seeing some of the techniques that are used and getting a sense of what works, what doesn't work. It's always a little bit of a trial by fire. Some things, you're always sort of trying new things with new communities. You're never quite sure what's going to work, what's not going to work.
I think that's really worth emphasising, particularly in a depressed job market, is to be proactive about getting involved in ways that maybe you're not getting paid, but you're still getting some good experience. City of Hobart have been running some really good community outreach, and sometimes it requires a whole weekend of you to go along and participate in things, but it's great experience. And you introduce yourself to the professional moderators. They're almost always from outside council. So there are things that you can do now that maybe aren't part of your formal study and that you won't get paid for, but are still really good in terms of putting together a portfolio of experience, but also figuring out for yourself whether it's something that you might like to spend your time on.
Yeah, and you can certainly have a strong sort of science hand. You can be great at plant ID, and that can be one way of participation and getting work in EIA. But there's a whole heap of other things too. Obviously seen a lot about the planning processes, the legal processes. But I really strongly think that there's a lot of opportunities for community engagement. So for me, that's like a second string bow for me, but it's good. I get invited to be part of a lot of things because I've got some kind of reputation in that area. So, having different kinds of strings to your bow is useful in this space. And I think that community engagement is pretty universal. Lots of cool stuff. So just even being able to answer what is a World Cafe or what is citizens jury and how does it fit in with deliberative democracy, I think would be a helpful thing to be able to know a bit about in job interviews. All right, so I don't want this to go on for too long, and so there's a little bit so that's most of what we want to cover is about community and taking community seriously. But there's a few other little bits about this that are, in this taking a more theoretical lens that we're doing today. So another way of thinking about EIA processes theoretically is seeing them as symbolic politics. So this means that decision making isn't rational in the same way as information processing. It needs to have some sort of basis in evidence. but it's instead based on the appearance, of what the decision looks like to the community. So you might you might still go through all of the same processes that you would in a more rational process, but obviously there's these sort of discretionary parts of it that allow different kinds of decisions to be made. So local councils are a really good example of this. So there are very progressive councils like the City of Hobart or the City of Melbourne that make lots of decisions going through a fairly standard environmental impact assessment process, where their decision would be seen as, they're making decisions that to send a message saying that they are progressive, that they do value environmental heritage, cultural heritage, other things like that, Aboriginal heritage. So that they will make decisions and emphasise the importance of these things to their community. So it's a symbolic gesture, even if it's still based in some evidence base. A different council or a different decision maker could make different decisions. More peri-urban and regional communities often are more focused on jobs and economic growth. So the same proposal going through the same process, you could end up with a different outcome, with the decision maker showing how important jobs and economic growth are to them, and so that's why they made the decision that they did. Even though the evidence is the same, the processes are the same, there are different outcomes that can be made. And I think we get a bit of sense of that with Clarence, so where the mayor and the council are seen as kind of pro jobs and pro growth. So that's the same kind of thing you think would end up with a different decision depending what council it goes through. So we certainly see that at a state and federal level as well. So for about 20 years, we've been in this very strong jobs and growth kind of world of conservative political decision making. So there are, the Adani we talked about a few weeks ago, there's decisions that get made that are really strongly signalling the political positions that these governments have. Even though we looked at the Adani EIA process, it's literally thousands of pages. It's probably the most comprehensive and probably some would argue the highest quality and the best environmental impact assessment that's ever been done in Australia. But still, the decisions get made to allow that mine to go ahead. So I can ask, what do you think of that? Are there any decisions that you know of that get made that ring true for you guys? Are there things that you've been involved with? Are there? No takers. I feel like this is a big thing in Tassie, that there is lots of virtue signalling and lots of people showing how committed to jobs and growth they are, how committed to the environment they are, and that are reflected in the decisions that they get made. So which obviously needs some connection to the impact assessment process, but I think there's a lot of symbolic politics going on in Tassie. And I don't want that to be a downer. Like, I'm not saying that that's the process is bad and it's it's not evidence based, but we need to recognise that there are these layers. So that decision making is complicated, and I guess I am arguing that it's rarely this information processing. So in something that's not controversial, it's possible that model makes sense. But in lots of decisions, and lots of important decisions in particular, there are these other layers that we need to think about. And I want everybody to think about, what do they think about this, and where can they see themselves participating in that process, which we'll get to in a couple of slides. So another important one is, I think, about political economy. So this is where environmental impact assessment benefits the private sector. So it provides certainty for development. So we see things like the strategic assessments, the one in Melbourne that allowed patches of highly threatened grassland to be removed and offset into the Western Grassland Reserve. It is an example where the EIA process is totally designed to give certainty to development, to allow development to go ahead. And I think arguably that's what happened with Adani as well. So there was a comprehensive EIA process, But in reality, probably the purpose of that process was to allow the mine to go ahead and to allow the developers to secure funding. Although clearly that's one of the things that's actually probably likely to lead to that project not going ahead in the long term. So I'll skip that. So just a couple of things I want to, these are things that are emerging in theory in EIA. So if you're reading some journal articles, these are the kinds of things that will come up. So one is there's a big trend in government accountability that's changed. So governments used to be seen as the organisations, the regulators that needed to be accountable. So there was a whole lot of processes built in that allows accountability. I'm sure some of you have seen the multitude of auditors' reports on all aspects of environmental things lately. There was one on the Western Grassland Reserve process that's absolutely damning, that these where there is this accountability processes like auditors still in place, they're consistently showing that the governments are abdicating their responsibility to do accountability. Often they're outsourcing this, so this idea of new public management that takes on private sector, private enterprise, economic rational, neoliberal modes of doing business are definitely being incorporated into government processes. So self-certification, financialization, being allowed to convert threatened species into money that goes into offset somewhere else. These are all extremely sort of neoliberal and ideas that have come from the private sector that have been adopted by public management. So I think I'm not sure if anyone is super familiar with this, but there was there used to be this thing called the Great Barrier Reef Trust that the government funded to hundreds of millions of dollars. So it has these accountable objectives, auditing, accountability. There was money given back in 2014, which was sort of just after the last Labor government, but before the Liberal government had sort of fully adopted, fully taken over this world. But now there's been this replacement. So the last round, which was in 2017, I think, gave basically $500 million to a trust that was run basically by mining company executives. And I don't think that they had set this up to do a bad thing, but they'd set this up to get corporate money to do good work on the Great Barrier Reef. So partly for corporate social responsibility reasons. So the companies can say they're doing a good thing. They've donated $500,000 or whatever it is to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. But the government, they had like 4 staff, managing this little thing. The government gave them $500 million to spend in the next few years. That totally means that there's no auditing, there's no accountability on decision making. So rather than there being a competitive, transparent granting process, there's this is a private organisation that can basically do whatever it wants. I'm maybe being a little bit strong in saying that, but it's a really big change in the way that the world of decision making around the environment is working. So we might have posted this, but if there's heaps of news stories about this from a year or 2 ago, there'll be a lot more news stories, I think, in the future. There's sort of noise starting to come out that the organisation wasn't set up to be able to spend that kind of money. So that there will be some kind of investigation into the effectiveness of that $500 million spend, and we'll see what happens. I mean, obviously that hasn't been done, and maybe they've been super effective, but the casual conversations I'm having suggest that that might not be the case. So yeah, this is the world that we live in. It's complicated, and but politics is important. I'll just quickly say that the two other really big issues that are in the literature at the moment are about quality. So how do we do high quality assessments given the fact that there's data deficiencies, left, right and centre. So Tassie's one of the best places that's set up for data, through the list map and the natural values atlas and all these things. But I'm sure through this and other units that you've realised that there's not a lot of resemblance to what you see on site to what's in these kinds of databases. So this will be an area that there is an exponential growth in data, and it could be that this gets better, but also I think that there'll be better processes that deal with, don't have the expectation of complete information. And the other one is about effectiveness. So, the purpose of environmental impact assessment is meant to lead to improved environmental outcomes, and there's very little evidence that shows that that's happening. So perhaps it's for all these other things that we're talking about now, the politics of it all, that's leading to bad environmental outcomes. But there's some fundamental questions that we need to ask about in environmental impact assessment processes. So yeah, I think that we should be looking for evaluations of effectiveness, and I think there'll be increasing scrutiny on the effectiveness of outcomes of environmental impact assessment processes. So that's probably something else. There'll be opportunities. That will be a growing field, I think, is working out how to better understand effectiveness. And yeah, it could be that the politics is working against it, but I think in reality, even whatever flavour of politician or developer you are, most want some kind of predictable, repeatable process that actually is not a total waste of money. They want these processes to be effective. So I think that improving effectiveness would be something that's generally supported across all sort of parties to these processes. But we have got a way to go. Yeah, hopefully I can, in a couple of years' time, I can do this and say, well, there's growing evidence that EIA is being effective, but I'm not sure that we're seeing a huge amount of evidence for that yet. Again, I don't want to be a downer and say it's not worth it. I think it's a really important process, but we do need to be realistic and to have scrutiny about things like quality and effectiveness. Work on making it better. All right, so last few slides, we won't go too much longer, so it's a relatively short talk today. So we've had all this talk now about politics and how do we do this evidence-based processes inside these political processes. So there's different ways that people think about this, but this is one framing that's sort of got a little bit of traction that people, so there's this guy, Roger Pielke Jr., who again is a little bit dodgy. I'm not sure I should be using all this stuff. I need to find a more reputable model, but the model itself is actually okay, where he talks about ways that people who generate evidence, so including scientists, engage with society. So he talks about pure scientists who are kind of off in labs and totally divorced from things like EIA or other sort of political processes. And that's all fine, but in practice, there's not too many of these, and they often, they might have massive impacts on the world down the track, but they don't, generally have much impact on the sort of day-to-day operation of decision making. But there are these other ways of engaging with evidence and science. So he talks about being an issue advocate, and I think in times gone by we would have said this is a bad thing, that scientists shouldn't be advocates for particular positions. So Roger Pielke Jr. talks about issue advocates as being people who try to reduce the scope of possible outcomes. So it means that they are prosecuting a particular argument, that they do scientific research, which may be very high quality, but it's trying to answer particular questions that support those advocacy positions. So we see this a lot, I think, in conservation. We see it in public health. We see it in climate change. We see it in economics from a sort of different political perspective, and urban greening, the kind of some of the stuff I do. So we see people who very strongly believe that a particular position within this world, and there's evidence they collect and the science that they do is based on that. So so I think 30 or 40 years ago we would have said, oh, science is objective and that's a bad thing. But in practice, I think most people are advocates about something. A lot of scientists, a lot of the academics, people you'll come across in your studies and you have come across in your studies will be advocates about seeing the world and looking for particular decisions in the world. So Roger says, don't be a stealth advocate. So this is a really bad thing. There are some people who claim to have scientific objectivity, but they actually are prosecuting a particular position. So these people are really dangerous because they can undermine good outcomes by not acknowledging the position that they have. They can basically have people call them out as frauds and therefore undermine the science that they produce, which could be very high quality. So we've probably seen bits of that in things like climate science and other things too, where there's a lot of scrutiny and a lot of people, trying to look for ways to undermine evidence and scientific things. So we've got to be really careful. If we're going to be an advocate, that's fine, but we shouldn't shy away from calling ourselves that. Someone going to say something, or is that just a random? And the last few I've kind of bundled together. So there's what he calls as a science arbitration, which is basically where there's a process that's identified and scientists are asked to evaluate outcomes or options based on this scientific process. So the Threatened Species Scientific Committee I was involved with, it was definitely that. So we didn't really have discretion. There wasn't we weren't advocates. We weren't trying to get particular outcomes, but we were seen as the sort of arbiters of quality and were, that to make sure that things were rigorously assessed according to scientific processes. There's another term, which I don't really like this term, but they talk about honest brokers. So rather than being an issue advocate, these people will try to expand the scope of possible decisions. So rather than trying to reduce the number of outcomes, they're trying to increase the number of outcomes. So for those of you doing ecology, I think that you could talk about the difference between an ecologist and a conservation scientist, for example, where a conservation scientist might have a particular normative position that they're trying to protect a species or something like that. So that's the focus of their question. They're trying to reduce everything to focus on the thing that they're advocating. Whereas an ecologist might have a broader position that maybe has good conservation outcomes, but sometimes doesn't as well. So wouldn't necessarily be as driven by the normative ideas about conservation and things like that. And I guess the last one, which is not from the Roger Pielke world, but from a different sort of way of thinking about it, is actually scientists or evidence makers who participate in political processes. So these can be, like I think the chief health officers at the moment are a bit like that. So they're seen as, scientists who stand up and they, give you the scientific advice. But I'm sure that they're spending a huge amount of time with the politicians, canvassing different kinds of options and trying to influence so the health officers are trying to influence the political processes to the best that they can to get good outcomes based on the science, but understanding that there's political processes. So that they will stand up next to the premiers or next to the presidents and support the decisions they make. So absolutely participating in political processes. So with all of these, the issue advocates or any of these other sort of science arbitration or trusted advisors, these are all, in my mind, perfectly valid roles that people can play in the world. So I'm sure that some of you in the room are massive advocates or for the environment or fighting against development, but some of you are probably pro-development, trying to look to work out ways to improve jobs and growth in environmentally sensible kind of ways. So these are all absolutely valid positions, and something, I guess, as you're coming towards the end of your degree, you need to start thinking about what you're going to be in the world. And some of the decisions you make can have bigger consequences. They can open up job doors, they can close job doors. We're not saying there's a right or wrong way through this world, but just something to think seriously about. So I reckon that's about all I wanted to say. What do you want to say, Emma?
Well, just to think about Ray Brereton's role in this, because we did specifically ask him about this as part of Rosny Hill. Yeah. So this is kind of a general reminder that we are thinking about all this in the context of Rosny Hill and the ministerial brief, and the kind of things that you might be able to force into your 4 pages that demonstrate to us that you understand this bigger context. And, you know, including that last point, where does a scientist like Ray Brereton fit? What would you call him? So, yeah, that would be really going that extra yard to demonstrate against the highly distinctive standard in the rubric that you have absorbed the content of this unit and you're able to apply it.
Yeah. So probably in the terms of the ministerial brief, the minister doesn't want to read a brief by the issue advocate. He wants to read a brief by one of the other people who is talking about the different kinds of views. So it's not necessarily about coming up with the right answer. It's about providing the decision maker, the minister in this case, with all of the information to the best of your abilities to be able to make a decision that is ultimately a political decision. Often, not always, but often. So yeah.
So for those of you who weren't on site, just to repeat what Ray said, Ray's not employed to have a position on the development. Ray's a fauna expert and generally a very experienced ecologist who understands the Tasmanian environment really well. And he has a valued expert opinion about the possible impacts on the environment of the hill. And yeah, he was quite clear about that and comfortable with that in terms of his role. So his formal role with respect to Rosny Hill is that he's being employed as a consultant by council, Clarence City Council, paying Ray to appear at the tribunal as their expert witness in helping explain the decision making. And yeah, so eventually in November, Ray will be called to talk about what he thinks the impacts are on the environment.
So he's probably been quite careful, I would say, through his career to position himself as an ecologist, to be someone who would be seen to provide advice that's not prosecuting any particular position. So, I mean, clearly he would be concerned about threatened species, but in a way that's consistent with national and state legislation. So he would be able to, to do that. So to be honest, lots of the people I work with are not like that, but they are absolutely issue advocates. And so it's particularly around grasslands in Melbourne. I'm constantly contacted by my mates in Melbourne who want to write, letters to the minister and want to write public articles, criticising the process and doing things like that. And it's great that they do that, but that's not a path that I've chosen. And but that has led me to places like the Threatened Species Scientific Committee because of those decisions that I've made as well. So all of these things are good. I think that for some of you, writing a ministerial brief and actually trying to think about this stuff from different points of view might not be something that you naturally do or want to do in the future. But it's a really important skill. If you can recognise this stuff, it gives you, there's a lot of people in the world who aren't able to see things from other points of view, but the people who can, I think, are able to have more sophisticated contributions that they can make, even if it is prosecuting a particular advocate's position, or not, or they're all valid things.
So a couple of quick things, and we can expand on some of this next week as you start getting into your own writing and you figure out what you're not sure about. When you go to appeal and when an expert appears before the tribunal, they have a legal responsibility to the tribunal. So even though the council is paying Ray to appear there, Ray is there at the appeal to help the tribunal reach the correct decision is the legal way of putting it. And so he must provide fulsome and honest answers, and he's definitely not there in the employ of the Clarence City Council for them to defend their decision. So that's really important in terms of what we've just talked about. Ray's responsibility is to be professional ecologist Ray and not to get a particular outcome. And Tribunal makes that really clear. The other important thing that happened on site, just for the sake of those of you who weren't there, Dave Heaton asked a really good question about the Aboriginal assessment and that it wasn't done. And so even though we might be thinking in our heads, oh, that's a bit crap, how do you put that in the ministerial brief? Because you're not going to say, Minister, this is a bit shonky, lift your game. You need to use very professional, neutral language about this potentially being a bit of an admission. You know, we happen to know of a nearby case study in the safe local government area, Geilston Bay, where one was done, and it was quite important in terms of adjusting the development. So part of what will help you with next week is about the tone and being very professional about this, something that somebody like Ray is very practiced at and is really important.
So yeah, I think you could phrase something like that, just as an absence of information. We don't have information to be able to, to make that. So therefore, it's more difficult to make the right decision when you're lacking information. So saying that information is lacking, but it could also be phrased as a risk, so that if you make a decision, there's a risk that it won't be the right decision because of this lack of information. So, there's different parts of this that we've talked about. You could also talk about engagement. So we haven't adequately engaged, the community engagement. I think, again, for those of you who were there, I don't think that the community engagement process at Rosny Hill, at least from what we've heard, has been adequate. And you could say that the Aboriginal people have not been adequately engaged. And so again, there's, as well as information deficits, there's community deficits, where all those things that we were talked about, testing information, so those things haven't been able to be done because of the lack of community engagement around that process. So I hope that's not too leading, but I think that there's ways of writing that's sort of in quite neutral terms that highlight what's known, what's not known, and providing a range of stuff. So I'm sure the minister really wants to know that, so that when they make a decision, they're going to expect some heat from the community. So they need to know that, I think.
And from our perspective, this is an opportunity to point out the things that you know. So I think this is a really good point that Dave has just made about information deficit. If we go back to the early part of today, we have spent a lot of time in this unit so far on that whole information processing way of looking at environmental impact assessment. So that would, in that context, and you could even cite that as being the lens that we're using, or the normal lens, in that case, there's quite a lot of information missing. So that would be a really clever way of tying all that together.
Yeah, but definitely make sure all the rules are followed, and all that kind of stuff too, because the minister does not want to have his decision overturned from some kind of planning rule technicality. That's something they absolutely don't want.
So I will spend a bit of time next week going through the brief and the template that we've provided for you. So if you're confused about how today might fit into your assessment, just reread that reasonably long document that we provided you, because there's various points when all of this could come up quite organically. And so just to remind you, because a couple of people have asked me, is that we have provided a fair bit of information about what we're expecting. Do take note of where most of the marks are allocated, because you could hand in great work, but if it doesn't match up with the rubric, there's not much that we can do in terms of rewarding you. And we have supplied you with a template to put that work into. So I'm pausing because I'm just stopping to read the chat. Yes, a brief outline of the proposed development. So always bear in mind who you're writing to. This is a super busy person who's got lots of things in his ear. This is one of goodness knows how many current issues that he needs to be across. It is he. So just remind him, don't go launching into the details. Where is this and what is this about? You do only have 4 pages to explain all that. So it does just need to be brief and actually running to us, not the minister. So of course we know all about it. But yeah, just a brief outline. Don't take up the whole first half page describing the development and all the documents that already exist. I'm going to stop the recording.